we're going to talk about historical form that capitalism has taken over time and why it's taken these forms across time, especially focusing on neoliberalism, which is the form of capitalism we have today. Privatization and the increasing reliance on NGOs. We had the globalization of capital and production. We had a growing focus on individualism, the rollback of the welfare state and a turn to austerity, increasing role of finance in the economy. That's an important feature of neoliberalism, as well as the decline of the trade union movement and stagnating wages, the shifting balance of class forces toward capital. Adolf Reed once defined neoliberalism, I think very well, as capitalism without working class opposition. And I think that's pretty much what we're looking at. Those are definitely some of the major features of neoliberalism that distinguish it from the kind of capitalism that existed before, which is oftentimes called Keynesianism. That's a bit of a problematic name for reasons we don't need to necessarily go into. But that's just to put it out there, that's what people often refer to as pre-neoliberal capitalism, as Keynesianism. So in order to understand, what is neoliberalism, I think it's useful to kind of go back to the birth moment of, the modern capitalist world that we live in, which is basically at the end of World War II, when the American state emerges as the dominant force in the world for the first time and is ready to take responsibility, ready and able to take responsibility for kind of managing the world system in a new way. That is the point of origin of the world that we're now living in. So I think in order to understand what neoliberalism is, for me, I always like to think historically about how it emerges. So for me, the question of what is neoliberalism is very closely connected to how does neoliberalism come about? What are the processes through which it developed, and how does it form out of a previous form of capitalism? It's worth pointing out that the first half of the 20th century was really something. It actually looked like capitalism might not be possible at all, like as a stable form of society throughout the whole first half of the 20th century. Capitalism in its industrial form, in its kind of modern, large-scale form, really emerges in the late 19th century. The first corporations only begin to take shape 1880, 1890. By the time you get to 1900 to 1945, the end of World War II, you basically have a series of economic crises every 10 years leading up to the Great Depression, right, which is the worst capitalist crisis in the history of capitalism up until that point, and then 2 world wars. So, 2 world wars and a Great Depression throughout the first half of the 20th century, it's a reasonable question. And people did ask, whether capitalism could be a stable social system at all that could kind of survive across time and wouldn't need to be severely modified in order for it to be able to continue to reproduce itself. What was new after World War II, which we're going to get into today, was the American empire emerged as an informal empire. An informal empire. And what I mean by informal empire is that rather than being characterized by the conquest of territory, the actual annexation of additional land to the American domain, the American empire was an imperial system that was based on a world in which all states were formally independent. This was relatively new. The British Empire had a kind of hybrid example of this, a hybrid form of this, partly informal, partly formal. But to run the entire world system, the entire world capitalist system, as an informal empire, as governing a world of independent states, was completely new. The American empire within this system of independent states came to represent and came to organize the general interests of global capital. Not just capital inside of the American social formation, inside of the American society, but capital all around the world, the general interest of capital internationally. That was what was new about the American empire coming out of World War II. And what they did was they stitched together local capitalist classes in each different particular state within a single integrated global capitalism. Not, different regional capitalisms or different national capitalisms that are combined into a world system, but one seamless world of global capitalism. So that's just to give you an overview of some of the themes, I think, about that we're going to cover today in order to understand how we get to neoliberalism. But to begin, I think we have to look at the post-war moment. After World War II, the American state emerged as by far the most powerful state in the world. In a world of independent states, as the European empires disintegrated. So whereas like each of the great, European empires was characterized by each individual European state, imperial state, colonizing its own particular area of the Earth's surface, in some cases directly administering those areas, the American state now was facing a new kind of world in which these imperial systems were breaking apart. And what that meant was that all of these areas that had previously been absorbed within these colonial empires of the European states were now going to be independent states. They were no longer going to be colonies. They were now going to be independent states. So American planners coming out of World War II are looking at this world. They're emerging as the most powerful state in the world, and they're trying to sort out how are they going to govern this place? How are they going to exercise their power as the most powerful state in the world? And all of its industrial rivals, of course, were demolished. The European powers were destroyed. They were bombed to smithereens. They had just come out of World War II. Japan, likewise, was being rebuilt by the American state. It was completely destroyed. So in this context, the American state decides to take the absolutely unprecedented step of rebuilding its major industrial rivals in Europe and Japan. So these states are its major industrial competitors, its major industrial rivals are defeated, they're destroyed, and the American state takes the unprecedented step of rebuilding them through a program called the Marshall Plan in Europe and the reconstruction of Japan. Poured massive amounts of aid into those states to rebuild their economies and to rebuild their capitalist states. And they encouraged their corporations after the war to invest internationally, to start this process of integrating the world under its hegemony. Through this process, the American state took responsibility for managing what became a worldwide economic system, which required it to develop a unique set of institutional capacities and to bear significant costs necessary to execute these functions. It wasn't cheap. And it wasn't automatically the case that capitalists in the United States, for example, would accept these costs, which meant, among other things, unprecedented levels of taxation in peacetime. The income tax only began just before World War I. That was the income tax just started then. Taxes were something that was kind of imposed during wars if the state had to raise money for an exceptional purpose. Now, wartime levels of taxation were going to be sustained forever. This was a huge cost for the American capitalist class, and for the state had to be completely rebuilt in order to develop the capacities necessary to facilitate this global restructuring and its global imperial responsibilities. What would be different as the American empire emerged from the ashes of World War II was that rather than the system of inter-imperial rivalry that existed between World War I, leading up to World War I, and between World War I and World War II, whereby individual capitalist states constructed their own colonial systems and they fought each other externally through a system of inter-imperial rivalry, right? Each state protecting its own colonial system, each state protecting its own imperial system, and inter-imperial rivalry between these states, which is what led up to World War I and World War II. Now, what would happen, what would emerge is a condominium of states. The American state would take overall responsibility for safeguarding the interests of every capitalist state, and it would organize a condominium of advanced capitalist states at the very core of the world system under its leadership. Rather than having external rivalries between these states, now they're all going to be a kind of super empire organized under the overall dominance of the American state, which would represent all of their interests as a worldwide hegemon. Linkages developed between the US and the other wealthy states that were more significant for the first time than linkages that ran north-south between wealthy capitalist states and their colonial empires. So in the system of inter-imperial rivalry, the densest linkages, economically and politically, ran between the states at the center of the world system, the advanced capitalist states and their colonial empires. Now, the densest linkages, both politically and economically, militarily, investment and trade, everything ran between the American state and the other advanced capitalist states in Europe and Japan. So what this meant was the kind of bloc had consolidated at the core of the world system around the power of the American state, which collectively then came to dominate the peripheral states, and which the American state would represent and enforce those interests. In this moment, at the end of World War II, the system they designed was called the Bretton Woods system. And we don't need to get into the details of what the Bretton Woods system was, but the important thing is that the dollar was at the center of it. Every country's currency was pegged to the dollar. You could exchange your currency for dollars at a set rate, and the dollar could be exchanged for gold at a set rate. So the dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The rate at which these things exchanged were just decided upon. They were fixed. And there was barriers, there was restrictions on the ability for capitalists to move investment around the world. If you wanted to invest in a foreign country, there were all kinds of restrictions on how much you could invest. You had to take foreign partners who lived in that country. You would be at many different disadvantages vis-a-vis capitalists in that country in many different ways. National capital was given a priority in those different social formations in different ways. Similarly, there was only so much of your profits that you could repatriate from that country back into your home country, back into the United States or Europe. There was limits on your ability to take profits, to extract profits from those social formations, and there was limits on your ability to move capital around the world. This system called Bretton Woods provided a stable framework to promote global economic integration, to promote trade, growing trade relations among the states of the advanced capitalist core, but also among the states in the periphery, but especially between the states of the advanced capitalist core and the states of the periphery, and to rebuild the capitalist economies of Europe while developing capitalist economies in the global periphery and the global south, build capitalist states with stronger institutional foundations, and to support American power. And the period of growth from 1945 to 1968 was rare in capitalist history. It was a massive post-war boom, fueled in part by the extensive military spending that took place during the war and all the technologies that were developed through the state just pouring unprecedented amounts of capital into its advanced industrial sectors. All these corporations were completely transformed by World War II. American production doubled output, doubled during the war and after. And all the corporations, the advanced industrial corporations, were completely transformed by this. The technologies that they used, the production systems that they used, and the scale of the accumulation that they were taking part in was totally revolutionized by what the state did in World War II. And the result of this from 1945 to 1968 was what's called the post-war boom. Within a generation, however, the Bretton Woods system had already begun to fray. The European states and Japan had recovered, or had largely recovered, and they were exerting increased competitive pressure on American corporations. Meanwhile, the internationalization of trade and foreign investment promoted by Bretton Woods increasingly contributed to the growth of global financial markets and eroded the controls and the limits that Bretton Woods was based on. It put pressure on those barriers, and it put pressure on fixed exchange rates. It became harder and harder to sustain those linkages as the free movement of investment, foreign direct investment around the world increased. Bretton Woods was kind of based on drawing a difference between trade and investment. Trade was okay. Free movement of capital and investment should be limited. But this actually became very, very hard to sustain in practice. Capitalists did things like, for example, if there's a barrier to trade, blocking off a peripheral state, for example, or a semi-peripheral state from foreign investment, capitalists could just jump over the tariff barrier, open up a production facility in that particular state, and sell their goods inside of that tariff barrier. So you could jump over tariffs. You could open up a factory on the other side of the tariff wall and sell stuff on that side of the tariff wall. You couldn't move all the profits in and out, and you couldn't internationalize this production by selling that stuff that you're making there everywhere, but you can open production facilities inside of every tariff wall and sell goods inside of each social formation. So this started to lead to the internationalization of the economy in a way that eroded and put pressure on fixed exchange rates and capital controls, the barriers to moving capital around the world. It started to create global capital markets, global financial markets. Ultimately, by the time you get to the 1970s, with the Vietnam War heating up, with the Great Society programs in the US, a huge amount of increase in state spending on social welfare programs for people of color, especially in the South, in order to deal with the civil rights movement, in order to demobilize the civil rights movement, public housing, job training programs, educational subsidies, all this kind of thing. That put a lot of pressure on the ability for the dollar to maintain its relationship to gold, its fixed pegged relationship to gold. And what that meant was in 1971, what that led to was in 1971, fixed exchange rates and capital controls were abandoned by Nixon for the first time. The gold standard, the pegging of the dollar to gold ended. And what happened instead was, for the first time, you had a system of floating exchange rates, where currencies now exchange at a rate that is determined by market supply and demand. No longer are states pegging their exchange rates to the dollar at a set rate. Now we start moving toward a system of floating exchange rates based on market exchanges. And this is a very volatile system also. There's another important consequence of that. And we get into some of the consequences of that later on. But one of the consequences is the growth of derivative markets. So everybody knows of derivatives as this big bad thing that is speculative and led to the 2008 crisis. But derivatives, to a large extent, emerged as a way of hedging risks based on sudden exchange rate movements that emerge after you move toward floating exchange rates. If you're a corporation and you invest abroad, you can wipe out the value of your commodities before you even bring them to market based on a sudden shift in exchange rates and interest rates as well. So that aside for now, we're going to come back to that. One of the crucial features of the post-war boom was what's called productivism. Productivism was basically a system whereby trade unions bargained with capital to maintain wage increases every single year at a rate that was tied to the growth of productivity. Now, productivity just means it measures the amount that is produced per unit of working time. So if productivity is growing, it means that every worker during every hour of their shift is producing more. What unions did is they made sure that the gains to be made, the gains that resulted from productivity increases, were evenly distributed between capital and labor. So what that meant was that both wages and profits could rise together. Both labor and capital gained a fixed share of a continuously increasing, continuously growing pie. So they each got a fixed share in the distribution of income, but the pie itself was growing. So each of those shares was also growing. So this was called productivism. And as long as productivity growth continued, unions were able to win continuous wage increases, continuous raises every year or every bargaining period without eating into profits. Both profits and wages could grow there. With the end of the post-war boom, however, once you hit 1968, 1969, and the post-war boom is starting to slow down, the technologies that had developed during World War II began to exhaust their possibilities to increase productivity growth. The post-war boom began to come to an end. And this created a problem because trade unions still wanted to push for their wage increases every year or every bargaining cycle. And so if the pie is no longer growing because productivity growth is declining, but trade unions still are engaging in wage militancy in order to sustain wage increases every year, what's going to happen to profits? They're going to go down. Wage militancy now would eat into profits because rather than gaining a fixed share of a growing pie, the pie isn't growing. And trade unions are now bargaining for a larger and larger share of that pie. So inequality starts to go down, but so do profits. And capital starts to say, well, if I'm only getting this amount of profits, or I'm not sure how much profits I'm going to be able to get at the end of this production cycle, I'm not going to invest. So investment started to slow down. And if investment starts to slow down, what happens to growth? If capitalists aren't investing in production, what happens to economic growth? It declines. So you start to run into an economic crisis characterized by declining profits, declining investment, and wages that are staying the same. So wages are eating into profits in a larger and larger way, and capital's not investing because they're not getting enough profits. They don't feel like it's worth it. They'd rather hold on to their money. There's too much uncertainty. So you start to run into a crisis. And this crisis is called stagflation, the 1970s crisis, the stagflation crisis. And it's called stagflation because it combines inflation with economic stagnation. That's stagflation. You know, the reigning Keynesian economic orthodoxy had held that you can't have this situation, but they did have that. So the Keynesian economists were discredited, the economic common sense was discredited, and the state and business engaged in kind of frantic search to figure out how to restore accumulation. And the crucial question for restoring accumulation and restoring profits is disciplining labor. But that's incredibly difficult to do in a situation where trade union rights, ever since the New Deal in the 1930s, are institutionalized within the legal structure of the state. Workers aren't breaking the law by having unions. You can't just tell them that the unions are over now, and you can't force them to work. So the search for a way to discipline labor in the 1970s was frantic on the part of the state and capital, and neither capital or the state had any fucking idea how to do it. And they spent 10 years basically trying to figure out what to do, during which time they instituted wage and price controls, which were, fixed controls imposed by the state on what wages and prices could in fact be. But this was like impossible to administer. They still couldn't get the unions to listen. And on top of that, the actual reality, which they couldn't really admit publicly, although they did privately in all kinds of ways, was that the whole purpose of wage and price controls was to restrain wage growth. It's very difficult for an elected official to win an election by saying, I'm going to cut your wages. So they had to try to act like, oh, well, we're putting it on business too, we're limiting prices too, but it's also limiting wages. But they always had to do this in a way that was intended to put wages down more than prices in order to restore profit margins, right? So corporations could charge more and wages would go down. That meant that profit margins would go up. This herky-jerky system of wage and price controls came and went in different forms throughout the entirety of the 1970s as capital and the state tried to sort out how to deal with this problem. The solution eventually came through restoring class discipline at home and globalization internationally. And the way that they restored class discipline, those are the two key features through which the 1970s crisis was resolved. Class discipline at home and globalization. Those were the two-pronged attack that restructured capitalism and allowed the 1970s crisis to come to an end. So capital is not investing. They need to restore, they need to get capital to invest, and they need to be able to suppress wage growth. So they do that through globalization and class discipline. But class discipline, of course, as I was just saying, is a really tough nut to crack in the context of a state in which you have trade union rights institutionalized. What they ended up doing was in 1979, what was called the Volcker Schock was implemented. The Volcker Schock was basically the Federal Reserve, the new incoming Federal Reserve chairman, Paul Volcker, hiked interest rates to historically unprecedented levels in order to break inflation and cause a recession. The goal of the Volcker Schock was to cause a recession. The recession would succeed in disciplining labor. Why? Because there was increasing unemployment. The reserve army of labor, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, started to grow, and workers became afraid. They were competing now with all this reserve army for jobs. Eventually, the recession that resulted, the economic recession, did force workers to accept wage restraint. It also restored confidence in the dollar internationally, in the context that I was mentioning earlier, where the gold standard is being abandoned, new system of floating exchange rates is being introduced. International confidence in the dollar system is at a nadir. Gold is gone. In a situation in which the gold peg, in which your currency for the first time is no longer backed by gold, supposedly in Fort Knox, where anybody who brings dollars can exchange it for gold, now it's just a piece of paper. So what that meant was that the state really had to be brutal in order to discipline labor and prove that it was serious about maintaining the value of this piece of paper. Without gold, class discipline and the willingness of the state to be utterly ruthless in bringing about class discipline became much more important. Democracy be damned. And what the Federal Reserve had to its advantage is that Federal Reserve officials are not elected. Not only are they not elected, they are the central bank, the Federal Reserve is independent. It is at a remove from so-called political pressures, or that is to say, democracy. So unlike elected officials trying to impose wage and price controls and impose wage restraint and put in place wage restraint, the Federal Reserve had no such concern. It can hike interest rates sky high, lead to rising unemployment. The economy goes into recession, but it doesn't matter. They don't have to worry about legitimation. Remember, we talked about the three sets of state functions: coercion, legitimation, and accumulation. Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't have to worry so much about legitimation. It doesn't have to worry about elections. It can be as coercive as it wants in order to serve the needs of accumulation. So what starts to happen with the Volcker Schock is the state, the balance of functions within the state start to shift away from legitimation and toward accumulation. The legitimacy of the state, its democratic legitimacy with the population, begins to be sacrificed in order to uphold the interests and the needs of accumulation. So you have, therefore, a more coercive state, a state that is less concerned with looking democratic. And this comes with a lot of the things people were talking about, the rollback of the welfare state, right? The welfare state, after all, is primarily a means for legitimating capitalism. Workers rebel, they think it's not nice to be thrown out into the street when they lose their job or go hungry. So the state has to respond to that rebellion during the New Deal period by putting in place welfare state measures. Well, now those can't be afforded anymore. In order to restore accumulation, the state has to cut corporate taxes to help them boost their profit margins again, which means that they can't afford the extensive welfare state programs that existed through the New Deal. So in order to restore profits, those welfare state programs also have to be rolled back. Again, you see a shift with the beginnings of neoliberalism, away from legitimation and toward accumulation and coercion, a more coercive state, a state that is more hard in its commitment to upholding the imperatives of class power and accumulation. So to be sure, I mean, a recession means, right, negative economic growth. It means the economy is contracting. So of course, that means that some sectors of capital are hurt significantly. Capital was not, all happy about this. The biggest and most powerful capitalists were, but large parts of capital suffered because of the Volcker Schock. Whole businesses were going out of business, right? There was a a lot of pain involved for capital. But the important point is that capital emerged from the Volcker Shock stronger as a class. And this is, again, the importance of relative autonomy, like we talked about earlier, right? This is not something that was imposed because a particular capitalist called up Paul Volcker and said, here's what I want you to do. It's what the central bank, what the Federal Reserve saw as being in the general interest of the system as a whole. And it involved a significant amount of pain for capital. But as a whole, at a systemic level, at a class level, capital was strengthened by it, even though not many capitalists would have seen this as being something immediately desirable. Throughout the subsequent years after the Volcker Shock, to this day, to a large extent, the Federal Reserve remained committed to an anti-inflation monetary regime. Its primary goal is fighting inflation. And what that means is class discipline. What that means is that every time you start to see the economy growing enough where the labor market starts getting tighter, right? The unemployment starts dropping too low, the Fed raises interest rates, which slows economic growth and disciplines the working class. So anti-inflation politics is a politics of class struggle for the Federal Reserve. It's a politics of maintaining class discipline in the interests of stabilizing capitalism. This episode also shows the limits of wage militancy, right? The unions were bargaining for more wages and they were being very militant about it. The inequality was going down, they were eating into profits. But what exactly was the plan? If you're causing a capitalist crisis, once you've reached that point, just to keep asking for more and more wages, when unemployment's going up, when the economy is in crisis, there was a total lack at this moment, in a very important way, of a kind of broader political thinking on the part of the trade union movement that could have led to a transcending of wage militancy and a shift toward talking about democratizing some part of investment, rather than just saying we want more money, which had been the basis for post-war productivism. They could have said, well, we don't want to just leave the economy up to the corporations anymore. Rather than being so fixated on wage rates, they could have said we want to democratize some part of investment so that the investment starts serving social needs instead of just the profits of big multinationals. Start transitioning away from capitalism, or at least start transitioning away from total monopoly of investment on the part of private capitalists. But alas, that was not to be. Instead, trade unions reluctantly accepted wage restraint after the Volcker Shock, and they kind of hoped at that point that ultimately normalcy would be restored. That ultimately, the good old post-war boom would kind of come back and productivism would come back. And this was just a kind of unfortunate interregnum in the general trajectory of the progress of the American middle class and the American working class, right? But it was not to be. It was not to be. And that's a real tragedy because unions, this was a real high point in a way for the power of the trade union movement. But it's also a moment in which the total lack of a political awareness and a commitment to a political project beyond just wage militancy really becomes tragic. Because you could see how there was just no way to sustain that program, and there was ultimately no choice for them but to accept wage restraint in the hopes that they could restore the kind of post-war boom. So the discipline of the Volcker Shock paved the way for a second the second prong, the second leg of the restructuring out of the 1970s crisis, which was globalization. And of course, globalization also served to discipline the working class, right? What happened was, unlike the Bretton Woods system, which as we saw, had already started to unravel in the early 1970s with the pressures on the system of fixed exchange rates and capital controls. Now you start to see a reduction of trade barriers all around the world. All of these controls, capital controls, fixed exchange rates are already gone, capital controls start to fall, and you start to have instead the emergence of a new seamless world of capital accumulation. So rather than the Bretton Woods model of I have a factory in Brazil that I used to sell inside of that tariff barrier. I have a factory in France that I used to sell in that tariff barrier. I have a factory in Germany that I used to sell in that tariff barrier. Instead of that system, you make the auto, the seats are produced in Mexico, the glass is produced in South Carolina, and the rubber, the tires are produced in wherever, right? And rather than having redundant production facilities, you start to have a seamless integration of different stages of the production process, one single production process, one single global production process located wherever costs are the lowest. So you can dismantle all these redundant facilities that are necessary to be all over the place because of tariff walls and just have one globally integrated process of production of your particular commodity. That's much more efficient for you. And it also allows you to locate stages of production, particular stages of the overall process, wherever it costs you the least, wherever regulatory costs are the lowest, wherever labor costs are the lowest. This meant that production could be offshored to lower wage environments. Jobs could be sent abroad. This served to restore profitability and to intensify competitive pressures, especially on smaller and medium-sized capitalists who couldn't restructure. So only the biggest corporations and the most powerful corporations are going to be able to survive this, because it's pretty expensive to be able to set up globally integrated production systems. And if you can't, there's no way you're going to be able to compete. So this led to a huge amount of concentration and centralization in the hands of the biggest corporations. This was supported by the internationalization of finance. So now financial markets are integrated. Every financial system in the world, especially among the advanced capitalist countries, starts to be integrated into one seamless global financial system. So capitalists can send money, can send investment anywhere in the world at no cost, instantly. And you can repatriate as much of the profits as you want back home. Any kind of barrier to the ability to move capital, to move investment anywhere in the world you want at any time is dropped successively between the 1980s and up through the 1990s. So you have a seamless world of capital accumulation where you can move investment anywhere across the face of the earth as quickly as possible with no barriers, with a continuous reduction of barriers to that process. So the key principles of the new system, the neoliberal globalization system, is number one, national treatment of foreign capital within each social formation, which basically means that no longer can there be any prioritization of a state's own capitalist class. You have to treat foreign investors just the same as your own capitalists. You cannot draw any distinctions between the national origin of the investment. You have to treat it all equally. Secondly, the constitutionalization of free trade, of the free flow of goods and capital by way of free trade agreements. So constitutionalization. I just want to pause on this point for a minute, because constitutionalization is a very important term that I think captures really well what's going on here. What is a constitution? A constitution is a legal arrangement that cannot be altered by voting, that cannot be altered through elections, that no matter which party is in power, no matter what happens, the Constitution is the same. And sure, you can change the Constitution sometimes, depending on the state. There's a process for amending it, blah, 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 blah. But the point is that basically the Constitution is the fundamental framework within which all democracy occurs, all procedural democracy, elections, and the rest of it occurs. That is taken as a starting point for all the rest of the political process, right? What happens with neoliberal free trade is free trade itself becomes constitutionalized. States are locked into free trade agreements in a way that is designed so that they cannot be changed no matter which party wins the election in the future, the next election. So maybe the party that negotiates the agreement loses the next election because the population doesn't want that agreement, but that doesn't matter. Once it's negotiated, signed, and approved, It can't easily be changed without very, very severe consequences. So that's the constitutionalization of free trade. Free trade was worked into the very DNA of these states that would secure the free flow of goods and capital against the interests of labor and the environment. Right? The rights of capital are constitutionalized within the state. The rights of labor and the environment, not so much. This is seen in, for example, NAFTA, the European Economic and Monetary Union, the G7, and later the WTO. All of these organizations are the kind of superstructure of free trade, right? That reflects the constitutionalization of free trade. As I implied earlier, the neoliberal state was a particularly authoritarian state, is a particularly authoritarian state. It's a state that relies on raw force in order to uphold the interests of accumulation. Democracy be damned, interests of the working class be damned, interests of the environment be damned. And the state is configured, is reorganized to reflect that reality. This is what we call authoritarian statism. And authoritarian statism is related to what I was just describing, partly, in terms of the constitutionalization of free trade. Because if free trade is constitutionalized within the state, that means that democracy can't touch free trade. And so what that means is that you've got an authoritarian state, just based on that criteria alone. So global integration, free trade agreements have been accompanied by the concentration of state power within so-called technocratic state agencies, which are insulated from democratic institutions. They're the key nodes of power within the state, but they're insulated from democracy, from democratic input, from interest group pressures, even in many cases from the public even knowing what the hell they're doing. Like free trade agreements, for the most part, for one example, are negotiated usually in secret. Unless you have security clearance at a very high level, which, by the way, they give to corporate executives, you don't even know what's going on. So there's a kind of reorganization, a restructuring of state power going on through these free trade agreements, for example, as well as through the Volcker Schock in the case of the central bank, whereby state power is being concentrated within these very obscure and very insulated state institutions, which are insulated from democratic pressures. So that means, for example, the office of the US Trade Representative in the case of the American state. It means the central bank, the Federal Reserve, or the Bank of Canada in the case of Canada, right? These positions within the state become more important. So there's a myth, right, that I'm debunking here, which is that neoliberalism was characterized by the retreat of the state, that the state plays a lesser role in neoliberalism. It's hands off and it's laissez-faire and deregulation and all of that, right? That is completely false. What's actually happening here is not less state, but a restructuring of the state to make it more authoritarian and even more involved, actually, in the reproduction of capitalism, and states all around the world taking larger responsibility for reproducing the global system, for reproducing the conditions within their own societies whereby global capital accumulation can take place. And that means if there's a peasant movement that's trying to challenge, a free trade agreement, or a working class movement trying to challenge the right for a textile company to dump chemical dyes in the river and poison their children, that the state has to go in with its security forces and end those demonstrations to protect the interests of global capital. That's just one example, right? So not allowing these agreements and not allowing these arrangements to be submitted to any kind of democratic oversight means that people who protest, people who want it differently, will meet the fist of force from the state. And you saw that all over the place in Latin America, but also in the capitalist core, all throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The idea of authoritarian statism is that by concentrating power in these insular state agencies, disruptions to markets can be prevented, especially from democracy. Public policy is increasingly made, as I was saying, by central banks, the Treasury Department, trade representatives, and executives at the international level through trade agreements that are enforceable through transnational governance, right? Part of the shift that starts to happen as free trade becomes deeper over the 1980s and leading up to the 1990s is that larger and larger areas of domestic social policy start being subjected to free trade agreements. So all of a sudden now, what constitutes trade itself begins to shift, and so-called non-tariff barriers become a greater focus, which include things like environmental regulations, include things like labor regulations. And not surprisingly, usually when the WTO reviews these things, they find that they're unfair trade barriers. So larger areas of policy are being entrusted to these international forums and the state agencies that participate in them. During the 1970s crisis, capital's profits are being squeezed. One of the ways that the state helped to restore those profits was by slashing taxes, right? And with slashing taxes also meant you have to slash spending or go into deeper and deeper into deficit, which has its own problems. So ultimately it came with cutting spending. But it also came with an increasing reliance of the state on debt to finance its budgets. So beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you see a real sharp break where instead of being financed by taxation, to a larger and larger extent in that period, the state is financing itself through taking out loans, through debt, through selling bonds. Now, what this means is that the ability for the state to spend money on any particular set of programs depends upon the willingness of international investors to give the state money for that. So if the state is selling bonds in order to enact some expansive welfare state program, you would expect that interest rates on those bonds would shoot up really, really high because investors would be not so willing to lend that state money. So you start to have the emergence of what is sometimes called in the political economy literature a virtual parliament, where investors, like financial markets, start getting a kind of veto over state policy based on their willingness to buy state bonds. So in the event that the state is doing stuff that that financial markets don't like, the state is going to face high interest rates and a much more difficult time enacting those policies. So what that means is that fiscal policy in general, the ability of the state to spend, becomes very constrained. Becomes very, very constrained. You get a turn toward things like austerity and the rollback of the welfare state. Again, this reinforces the turn from legitimation toward accumulation. Again, you see the interest of accumulation winning out over the imperatives of legitimation. And in the absence of a working class movement that could have forced things to be otherwise, legitimation will be sacrificed to accumulation, as it was. So yeah, trade agreements are about restructuring and reconcentrating power in the state to protect international flows of capital, not weakening the power of the nation state. That's the kind of key takeaway from that. So I just want to quickly, I was about to read this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes from our comrade, Leo Panitch. This is from one of his books from the 1990s. He said, "It is through crises that capitalism historically has tended to recover its dynamism. Where and when it is unable to do so, and where no viable socialist alternative, or at least few means of democratic defense exist, the consequences are always appalling." So I think that's the key lesson. It's that capitalism does not collapse automatically because of a crisis. On the contrary, it restructures, it recovers its dynamism, and it's always worse. The consequences, as Leo says, are always appalling in the absence of a working class movement capable of imposing its own interests and being present in the process of that restructuring, which is always a process of class struggle, which is what we're seeing. That's what we're laying out here. The important point is that, so we went through, the free trade, the authoritarian statism, the rollback, the shift from legitimation toward accumulation and coercion. The key point is that all of this was organized within the new American empire, which was supported by the role of the American state, not only in securing global order in terms of its military interventions, but also by stabilizing and integrating global markets. The expansion of foreign investment that began to happen during this period, the growth, the huge, tremendous increase of foreign direct investment as a significant economic phenomenon. Unlike simple trade, unlike just exchanging one commodity for another, making something in one place, selling it in a different place, foreign direct investment means I, as a capitalist in the United States, am going to open a factory or part of a factory or part of a production process in El Salvador. The difference between simple trade and that kind of foreign direct investment is very important. What it means is that American capital, in the example I just gave, becomes a class actor within each of these societies. So capital is a social relation, right? And if American capitalists are investing their capital in a different social formation outside of the borders of the United States, then what that means is that American capital becomes a class force within that social formation. And the state that governs that social formation becomes accountable to American capital in a new way. What that means is that, for example, in the case of General Motors in Oshawa, right, is that the Canadian state now becomes very concerned about the interests, health, and viability of General Motors, an American corporation, in order to be able to legitimate itself by people in Oshawa having jobs and the economy growing and everything else. It now has to take account of the interests of an American multinational in a new way. So through foreign direct investment, American capital becomes globalized, and it also becomes a class actor within each of these social formations. And the states that govern those social formations now have to be concerned with the interests of those American capitalists in a relatively autonomous way as class actors. Meanwhile, that's the first step. The first step is the American capitalist class globalizes. The second step is that the capitalist classes within each of these social formations, within non-American social formations, themselves globalize. They themselves invest abroad. So American capitalists globalize through foreign direct investment, through American capitalists investing in other social formations. At the same time, capitalists in those social formations are also investing abroad, including in some cases in the United States. So you see car manufacturers, non-American car manufacturers, for example, nowadays, opening up car plants, auto plants in the American Southeast, the so-called Sun Belt, right? That means that those capitalist classes those foreign capitalists are also now class actors inside the American social formation as well. So what starts to happen is the gradual erosion of anything we can distinctly call a national bourgeoisie. States no longer are supported by or linked to national bourgeoisies that are contained within their own social formation of their own economy. Instead, you start to see an internationalization of capital, a generalization and an internationalization of capital, articulated and formed within the American empire, who articulates its general interests. So the general interests of global capital are now articulated, organized, and expressed within the American state. And the other states that are part of the American imperial system also then take on an enlarged responsibility for reproducing the system as a whole, for reproducing the conditions for global accumulation. So you start to see there's a global capitalism here that comes about with the kind of neoliberal period, a truly global capitalism. So rather than regional or national capitalisms, these interests become globalized. Each individual nation state then in perpetuating and creating the conditions to sustain this global system, they have to maintain stable prices. They have to maintain the conditions necessary for the free movement of capital through their borders, for capital to move in and out freely and unencumbered, stable prices, constraints on labor militancy, disciplining working classes, and national treatment on foreign investment, and no restrictions on capital outflows. The ability for capital to move in and out of particular sectors, as well as for it to move across space, in and out of particular countries, states, regions, etc. Capital mobility, you may recall, tremendously increases the power of capital. because it means that capital, especially in the context of the free movement of investment during the neoliberal period, can exit from any particular social formation effectively cost-free. So if capital can exit cost-free, that means that if they're not happy with the conditions that they're finding in that particular social formation, they could pull out and invest someplace else. So the hypermobility of capital that came with the making of global capitalism in the neoliberal period and the reduction of trade barriers and the barriers to the movement of investment also meant tremendously increasing the power of capital as well, politically and economically, both in terms of its power to constrain what states can do, because they are, after all, competing to attract investment from multinational corporations, but also to contain working class resistance. With the hypermobility of capital, the power of capital is also increased. And you see an intensified competition between workers for jobs and between states for foreign investment. And increasingly, the fate of whole countries is now decided in the boardrooms of multinational corporations, based mostly in the United States and also in Europe. So what you started to see in this period is even social democratic parties that had long upheld the kind of social compact and the welfare state programs during the pre-neoliberal period, they start moving toward accepting so-called modernization and market-based reforms, while the periphery is locked in a dynamic of competitive austerity. Both of these are predicated on the acceptance of the free mobility of capital, this term progressive competitiveness. And this was the way that a lot of social democratic parties tried to sustain social democratic programs in the face of all these changes that we've just been describing, especially the global mobility of capital. What they said was, in countries with high labor costs relatively compared to, say, the global periphery, they basically said, they tried to entice capital to invest in their country, despite high wages and despite, in many cases, high taxes, because their workforces had specialized skills. And so they could produce high value-added exports that the relatively unskilled workforces of the global periphery couldn't produce. And so without putting any restrictions on capital, they tried to entice capital. Our workers are specially trained. Don't you want to voluntarily invest your capital in our society? But the problem was that ultimately the machinery necessary, the high technology machinery necessary to produce these high value-added exports could be globalized and sent to lower wage contexts. And capital increasingly didn't really see the need to pay high wages and high taxes when they could just as easily make these exports increasingly larger and larger components of those exports in peripheral society. So you start to see, even in the advanced industrial societies, the advanced capitalist states with welfare states, social democratic parties, oftentimes playing a major role in those governing coalitions, imposing wage restraint. Progressive competitiveness came with, we have to hold down wages, we still have to hold down wages, we still have to hold down wages. So the competitive pressures intensifying completely transformed the logic of social democracy in the context of this global competition for investment. And then meanwhile, in the global periphery especially, you see competitive austerity, where states are competing to provide capital with extremely precarious, low-wage labor, low taxes, and expansive rights for foreign owners. So you have progressive competitiveness in the social democratic core and competitive austerity and the periphery, both of which are predicated on accepting the free mobility of capital and buying into this logic that you have to compete rather than impose any kind of restrictions or challenge capital politically. So this now brings up some of the questions in terms of alternatives. One thing I think that comes out of this discussion is that the primary axis of conflict in the contemporary world order is not between states, but within states. Now, of course, there are very, very significant international conflicts, as we're seeing every single day on the news right now. We see huge changes happening in the world system in terms of the power of China and Russia, to be a separate independent pole within the American imperial system, but also, a whole host of transformations that have been going on in the economic system over the past couple of years. But from our perspective, as a working class, the most important things that are going on in the American empire, within the American empire, are the conflicts within states. Globalization is a form of class struggle. Imperialism is a form of class struggle. And the form that these things take is completely determined by the balance of class forces and the presence or non-presence of a working class movement and a socialist movement. So that's the first thing. The world market does have a hierarchical structure. Like, obviously, we know there are some states that are on top of this world market structure and other states that are on the periphery that have way less clout or way less prestige or prominence within the world market structure. But the point is that the nature of states' integration within this imperial system, even if that state is on the periphery, is such that the capitalist classes within each of these states have found it in their interest to integrate with the American empire. So there's a certain way in which the American empire, in the case of capitalist states, to a huge extent, is an empire by invitation. The capitalist classes that rule different states see the American empire and its global role in creating a global capitalism as being in their own interest. The peasants and the workers in those societies, their interests don't necessarily factor into it. But in terms of the capitalist classes, it's in their interest. And that strengthens those capitalist classes against the workers and the peasants in those societies and against the interests of the environment in those societies, right? That's what competitive austerity is all about, stripping away protections for labor and the environment. All this points to the fact that improving conditions for workers and getting somewhere better requires fundamentally limiting the competitive disciplines that are unleashed by globalization. That's the first and most important point, that insofar as globalization has intensified competition and competitive pressures on states and workers, it has been a form of class struggle that has disciplined those states and workers into the American imperial order. So for us then, the first and most important thing to take on is constraining or going against these intensified competitive pressures, breaking with the logic of globalization, and starting to think about things like capital controls, things that can put, possibilities for putting barriers on the free global movement of investment, such that investment becomes increasingly subjected to democratic determinations through nation states, not just nationalizing capital, but also then democratizing how those firms that you even are able to nationalize or the financial sector is run. So it's run on a fundamentally different basis than its authoritarian, despotic, form that it takes under capitalism. Only by breaking with globalization and breaking with capitalist competitiveness, can we improve conditions for workers and improve conditions for the environment, create a more sustainable and just economic system. This in turn means understanding how states have not just been victims of globalization, which have been bypassed by multinational corporations and transnational institutions, but rather seeing how states themselves have been the authors of globalization, have been restructured, and the direct forces that are implementing globalization through being restructured in a more authoritarian way, as we were talking about. That means that the states themselves are the agencies through which our political projects must be articulated and implemented. The state has not gone away. The state is still very much there, and it is the primary author of globalization. Therefore, it can be the primary author of breaking with globalization. So that's some concluding thoughts. It's important to recognize that during the neoliberal period, after the 1970s crisis was resolved, the corporate profits hit record highs. They were booming like crazy. And as of this moment, they are again booming. So the crisis of neoliberalism, if there is one, is more related to, legitimate. That's one of the kind of paradoxes of the dilemmas of our situation, is that capital is not in a profitability crisis right now, but it is in other kinds of crises. And so that creates particular problems and also opportunities, I think, for the left. Okay, guys, thanks very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.